we sort of had these pictures painted for us by a number of lawyers and non-lawyers, and now we're going to hear from some developers and maybe one lawyer on how they actually make this real when they're developing their apps in the real world.
All right, my name is Casey Oppenheim. I'm co-founder of a company called Disconnect. We're a startup based in Palo Alto, and we help users understand what is happening with their personal information online and give them control over online tracking. I'm here today with a great group of panelists. I'm going to let them actually introduce themselves, starting with Tim Wyatt.
So I'm Tim Wyatt. I'm the Director of Security Engineering at Lookout Mobile Security. Kind of come at this with two hats. One is a security researcher who is particularly interested in mobile security and privacy issues on behalf of our user base. And the other is as an app developer for a mobile-focused startup. And so some of the things that we're going to be talking about are things that we deal with every day as well.
I'm Reese Solberg, Director of Privacy for Microsoft. Before joining Microsoft, worked with a number of different legal departments for different startups, had my own failed startup. As someone has told me, that's actually called experience. And before that, worked for another startup in Copenhagen, Denmark for a couple of years. I'm a lawyer, not an engineer, so my apologies in advance.
My name is Jishnu Menon. I'm a data and product counsel at Mozilla. I work with Mozilla to kind of navigate some of these waters and the other waters that we have to go through to make sure our products come out right at the end of the day. And I'm going to be I'm also a lawyer, but I'm going to stay as far away from compliance during this discussion because I kind of want to focus on like core principles to kind of think about while you're designing, because I think those actually get you to the answers much quicker than focusing on, oh, Coppa or oh, this.
My name is Kevin Trilli. I'm head of product at Trustee, and we're a privacy services company located right down the street. And I've been involved with security, privacy, and trust for about 15 years, and also started early stage companies that have dealt with some of the issues of data collection and thinking through pretty sensitive data. And like Jishnu, thinking about my perspectives would be probably to balance the compliance, what I like to call compliance with benefits, where you can incorporate trust with consumers if you do the right thing, but you shouldn't be doing it just for compliance. And so a lot of different views I can provide on that.
Awesome. So the topic for our panel today is privacy engineering for app developers. And I think that in 1995, this may have been kind of optional reading for app developers, and today it's just cost of doing business. It's like doing your taxes. Even if you don't care about privacy personally, you're going to have to consider it. And so hopefully what we're going to do is we're going to run through some specific strategies for dealing with this issue. Before we get there, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to share your kind of high-level views on privacy engineering, and then we can maybe drill down. High-level views. This is your soapbox.
All
Tim.
right.
Go for it.
So time for the soapbox. So as developers trying to build a company, do these things, we're always very excited about moving fast, iterating on product, shipping quickly, getting it out the door. And it's very easy to not stop and think about some of these privacy issues along the way. But one of the other things that we've focused on that's been kind of a core principle for us over the last few years is a focus on delighting our users. And as an app that's requesting a lot of permissions to do a lot of the work that we're doing, which does interact pretty deeply with devices, we get a lot of questions about that. We've always been questioned about that. And so we've kind of, we've always taken a position, and I would advocate that everyone take this position, that we do not surprise people. We will over-communicate. We document everything that we do, and we try to do it in an approachable way that real people can understand, and not forgive me guys, but reams of legalese. So if there's kind of one soapbox that I would stand on, it's consider the fact that when you're asking for private information, you don't want to surprise people, and if you're focused on delighting your users, then you want to over-communicate and make sure that they have the right expectations about how they're interacting with your system.
So one of the panelists talked about privacy by design a little bit earlier today, and I That means a lot of different things to different people. For Microsoft, what that means is not only how we address our products, develop those products, but it's also about how we structure ourselves to support that. So we look at it from the policies, the people, and the tools and the processes. So the policies, I think different folks here have mentioned different principles, and Microsoft maintains those core basic policies which fit with general international standards around notice and choice. From that, we developed a core set of standards which then help guide developers in understanding where do they need to go, what do they need to do in different types of situations. So the next component is really in the people. And we've got about 50 plus full-time privacy folks across the company, and then several hundred more who are spending sizable portions of their time dedicated to privacy. And we provide training and education for all those folks. The next is really around the tools. Understanding that the development process takes time. We want to get engaged early in that. We do have different tools that help teams identify potential issues early on in the process, get an assessment of risk, and then they can get some feedback on how they're doing, where are the privacy challenges. And that's where the process comes in, making sure that those teams are following the process, so that they're identifying issues early on and getting the assistance they need. So that's kind of our perspective, and I think that's understanding what privacy by design means, maybe a core part of what we're talking about today.
And for me, my experience has been kind of interesting because I came in as a privacy lawyer with a background in it, but I started to realize that Mozilla has actually been working on privacy and designing privacy into its products organically over the past, pretty much ever since it started. And that was really fascinating. So I spent a lot of time kind of thinking about how these things are happening and the principles that underlie some of these discussions, because we're a community-based organization. A lot of it happens by discussion, by panel, essentially, which is interesting, but also great in a lot of ways. And so what I've really realized is I like to define things before I start kind of talking about them, and I'm going to set up kind of a V0.1 version of what privacy means in a product context for me, from what I've seen happen at Mozilla. And really, privacy, when you talk about your product, is a user's ability to have control over data about themselves. That's kind of core of what, when I use the word privacy, that's kind of what I mean. And the converse to that, the kind of like how you build in privacy into your products, is really about creating a dialogue between what your product does and what you do with that user's data, and then that user's expectations and choices, right? I mean, so it's really about marrying the two. That's what I consider creating user trust at a basic level. And when you start entering that exercise and really starting to think about that as one of the things, the boxes that you check when you go through, I am designing a feature, and then how does this impact a user's privacy, those two reference points are really useful. So anyway, I'll be, during the rest of the discussion, I think I'll be drawing on those two ideas to kind of set out my answers.
The two things I'd add to that, those great points were be that privacy is really becoming part of a brand or a reputation for a company. And you need to really think about the identity of your company and the ethos as being represented by how you interact with your end users and your customers. And there's an opportunity there for you to do the right thing. And I always like to say, if it feels wrong, it probably is wrong, or if it feels a little uncomfortable, you're hitting that boundary. And if you listen to that and build your products appropriately, it can really be a positive experience and really reflect on a way that you can build a positive reputation, build a great brand, and obviously differentiate in that regard. The second point, I think, is that, as you can tell by this group here today, that you're getting a marriage of a very unique discipline of policy meets technology. And the technology is rapidly creeping up. The way data is exchanged through the cloud, the way data is exchanged through ecosystems is very complex, and it requires a new level of understanding the way your products work that definitely goes to the engineering level and not just the general level of high-level flows. And this has required a new type of investigation, a new type of practice to really stay on top of what you're doing within your own products, but with also your partners. So vendor management really becomes that third part. It's very critical. Data flow is now a cloud in the term that we all know and use. But it's true, data is going everywhere, and you're a reflection of your partners as much as your own properties. And so it really requires considering that overarching brand halo as it applies across this data flow ecosystem.
Awesome, thanks guys. So that brings up a lot of questions. We're going to more specifically drill down into some of these issues. And the way that I'm going to propose that we do that is by thinking about the issue of privacy engineering in 3 parts. And the first would be the user part, the second would be the app developer part, and the third would be the recipient part. I'm actually channeling / butchering / plagiarizing work by Lori Craner at Carnegie Mellon, who wrote a really good paper that goes into this in detail some time ago. I think it was called, oh shoot, I can't remember the actual name, but if you look up privacy engineering, Lori Craner, and I think it was also, is it Sarah Speakerman? You can read more about it. It's pretty interesting and very detailed. But anyway, so that was kind of the way that I would like to kind of frame this discussion. And so the first sphere would be the user sphere. And I was hoping that we could get kind of each panelist to talk through some of the issues that have to do with making sure that the user information you do collect is something that they would expect, is handled properly. And Tim, why don't we start with you? You had said something about over-communicating and making sure there was no surprises. What are some specific techniques or ways that you can do those types of things?
Sure. I mean, for us, it's a question that we kind of routinely ask when we're talking about feature sets that we're going to add to the product. And it's something that we're very aware of because, in particular for my team, this is kind of what we live and breathe on a daily basis. But the question is always, will someone be surprised if they find out that we're doing this? And if we think that there's even a hint that that might be the case, then that's an indication that you need to go for a very explicit opt-in type of thing. And these things don't need to be scary. They don't need to turn people off. You can explain what you're doing, actually in a very friendly way, educate people about things. And we found that when we do that, things that we think might have some risk of being controversial actually have extremely successful opt-in rates. Because people understand what we're doing, they don't find it scary, and they agree to participate. The second thing is just kind of in general, being very clear about how you document what you do. We've had our primary app is an Android app, so you always have the kind of explicit permission dialogue on installation that people have to go through. And we set a policy very early on of anything that we're going to request needs to be justified and it needs to be openly documented. And we've had a standing page for going on 3 years now that does that. And anytime that we make changes, there's kind of a checkpoint that says, hey, do we need to go update that? And we also found that settled a lot of questions that people had about what are you doing? Why are you asking for this? That we would constantly get on inbound. So. Overshare and be clear about it, and it does a lot.
So I'd go back to something else that I think all of us were talking about when we first went through in terms of those principles, and I'd maybe rephrase it as that commitment to the user and to the user's privacy. It's on that basis that you build everything else. It may be a commitment driven from fear, right, of legal requirements, or it can be a commitment based on wanting to provide the types of products and services that your customers like and that they trust and they enjoy. So then the next step is once you get to that commitment and you work through those, what are your principles, what are your, for Microsoft again, policies and standards, then going through that process of looking at the product for the user, identifying those issues, and then understanding the context. Context has been discussed in the past as a key component of privacy. It's come back around again more recently. It's that understanding of what does the user expect and how do you message to that user at that time and give them the controls that they need.
So going to your second point about kind of thinking about the user and doing the more positive, like non-compliance focused work, I think a lot of the times doing that as a part of your product development cycle, because you're already doing it. When you think about the choices that you make when you give a user a certain UX versus another UX, you're already making those choices. Adding this kind of layer of, here's the gap, here's an information gap, right? Here's information I know about what I'm collecting, and here's what the user might expect, and kind of trying to close that gap, whether it's through oversharing or just kind of notices, or whether it's through actual product features, is something that's really important. So two things that I think are really great to do. One is model your user base. You're already doing it again for all sorts of other things. Model them when it comes to privacy, right? For Mozilla, we actually have two users. We have a novice, which is, let's face it, almost everyone in this room, including myself, and experts, which go deeper than almost anybody I could even possibly imagine into exactly the data flows, what the impact of the data is on overall identifiability of a user, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so model your users. So your privacy practices should map to all your users, and the way your product works should have a degree of satisfaction for all of your users, right? Just like all your other features do. And the second kind of major thing to really do is think about how you can close that gap by making features obviously do the thing that they are going to do. Like, for example, if someone gives you an email address in order to sign up for an account, they know what they're doing that for. If you're then reselling that email address later on, I mean, there needs to be a way to make that more obvious to the user. And a great way to do it would be through UX. You don't have to do it in Notice. So think about where you'd like to kind of do that, and show and not tell more with the way your features work. That's how we think about it.
I think expanding on that point a little bit further, the concept of user is important, because I think in the world of privacy, I think you can make an assumption that 100% of users want to know what's going on. A smaller percentage will want to take that extra effort to make controls and take advantage of the controls and really manage it more actively. But you need to address both of those constituencies as you're looking. I mean, if you want to get more granular about what your consumers are doing in your app or whatever, that's great too. But just generally think of it as you should always tell what you're doing, and then also have those controls that are available for the advanced user, the expert user, or what I would consider the privacy-sensitive user that really wants to take an active role in doing their data control. Because there's an overarching assurance you can give, and at least point the person to information, whether it's the platform level, your app level, or other, that tells them something is going on with their data, and then they can go find the controls if they're motivated, and of course make those controls easy to find and use.
It's interesting points. I think anecdotally, I feel like dealing with disconnect users, the thing that people don't like is when things happen behind their back. And I think Tim brought up a great point, is that sometimes oversharing, you think, oh, this practice, maybe users won't like it, but actually if they know about it, straight out, and like Jishnu was saying, and the rest of the panelists were saying, that if you give users in context your actual policy about what's happening, you may be surprised at what they're willing to expect. And by noticing that information, even if you think that it is oversharing or over communicating, you keep yourselves potentially on the good side of your users, and maybe just as importantly on the good side of regulators. So do people have any more thoughts on that particular issue?
I mean, I think what you said is exactly right. Users aren't just like, they're not sheep, right? They're not going to run every time they see something that, they understand people have to make money. They understand that things can be more complicated than maybe most people could understand. Again, this is myself included, and so you have to do some thinking on their part and figure out, first of all, how to communicate things in a way that people can understand, make intelligent choices over, and also I think this kind of flows into where you're going next, is start to make decisions for the user once you understand your user base and once you understand your product and your data flows, which those are two things that I think you need to do. Yep. You'll start making these decisions on how default behaviors work and how security works and how the internal workings that you can't educate a user about will work. So.
Yeah. Anybody else?
I was just going to ask the other folks on the panel here, in terms of one of the things that we found to be really, really useful is having those built-in checkpoints. And those checkpoints are with privacy professionals the idea is that there's another avenue for input into the process so that that process flows really smoothly and they're getting the input in a timely way. But it's an additional kind of layer of visibility into what's happening and kind of a checkpoint. I don't know if that's something that's resonates with other folks.
Just clarify, you're saying in the product development process or the
Yeah,
user?
so in terms of the product development
Right.
process and understanding sometimes, I know what I want to give that user out there. I understand it. We're driving towards that. I get the privacy issues, and there's that desire to really drive, and sometimes having that process that helps to bring in other folks and other viewpoints can be really, really valuable just to check the thinking.
Yeah, I think we found that firsthand when we've been in the back room, envisioning a product and having it mapped out in a certain way, and you bring an outsider that looks at it. And I think this introduces an important point about consumers is privacy is about values. And what's, for Jishnu, the way he would think about privacy is going to be very different than the way I'm going to think about privacy without even knowing our differences. But that's where you start to introduce perspectives that you think you're extremely right and thought through it thoroughly, and then there's a segment of users that just think of it differently. And that's, the outsider has really helped out in our perspective in that regard, for sure.
I definitely think the insiders do as well. I mean, I think recruiting people who care about privacy early and embedding them into the process is extremely helpful. I find the same thing with just with regard to general software security as well. There is no substitute for having people who are deeply embedded in the process every day, asking those questions and pointing those things out. And a lot of times I think you'll find that you get a lot more cooperation from your development team and your product teams when those people are insiders than you do, for instance, when they're coming from an outside InfoSec department trying to push these things off on strapped software engineering teams.
I think that's a great point. I think it comes back to talking about earlier in terms of having your core principles and having your fundamental commitment. So having the organization committed to that means that it flows through everybody.
Yeah, couldn't agree more with that. So let's move on to the next sphere, which is your sphere, the app developer sphere, and what happens when that user information comes into your possession. So what are some techniques there for that we can share for securing information, for example, for making sure that you're not combining information in weird ways, that you're not collecting as much, collecting, I guess, the bare minimum, other techniques in that regards.
Sometimes when you get started talking about these things, it's kind of hard to stay focused in these areas because they all interact so much together. Yep. I could sit up here and talk for forever about just kind of general security practices in software engineering. It starts with good development practices. It starts with thinking about these things early, putting a critical eye on things, and making sure that the data that you are collecting is being treated with respect, is being handled as sensitive user data. That you're applying good data security practices to how you store things, et cetera, et cetera. And then in particular, it kind of starts to easily branch out into the third-party domain. You really have to think about interacting with those people. I'm going to save that though until we get to that part.
I won't go into the security area because that's not my focus. So I'll step back a little bit and perhaps go back into the earlier question you raised, because I think that's where it's important to begin to look at this, is understanding very clearly what data is being collected, and then understanding how you are going to treat it before you've actually collected it, and making that threshold analysis and decision and applying those risk assessments at that point can really be very helpful rather than looking at it after the fact.
Yeah, and that kind of rolls into, as you're developing, the hardest part about developing, integrating privacy into your product lifecycle or any other parts is at the beginning when you haven't really done it before, and then you have to go through and kind of do some historical work to kind of think about, oh, here's all the things we're doing great, now let's figure out how this works. What's great about thinking about it during development is it lets you get rid of that going forward, right? I mean, you may still have some of that, but it's not going to be as much. You're gonna catch things as they come in and all this kind of stuff. And one of the biggest things that you said you should remember also is that every company is different. So engaging in, and every user base is different, right? So engaging in the dialogue internally about what you think is appropriate control for your user base. Again, this I go back to kind of like what I've seen at Mozilla. What is appropriate control for your user base? Starting there is really important. So even the fact that you're here and that you're thinking about privacy, having that high-level discussion about where is your organization going to take a stand, how does this kind of affect the brand and what your app is going to be and who it's going to be marketed to, is I think a fundamental part about all these other decisions about how you treat the data once it comes in and all that kind of stuff and how that rolls into the rest of your process.
I think two things I'll add. One would be about the way you think about your data as you've collected it. And one lesson learned I've seen that's pretty important is to think about as you collect data and it goes into your pool of your core database or whatever, is understand how it was collected, from where it was collected, and under what conditions, and ensure you're able to filter or segment or appropriate that data in different ways, because there'll be different rights associated with certain data. And if you structure your database in a way that's more complicated, it almost gets to be impossible to do that. And that might become very important downstream when you want to change a process or some new law hits or whatever it may be. And it's something you should think about at the database design level. The second is really kind of what I call the toothpaste out of the tube concern, where think about your partners and what you're giving access to downstream once you get it, either for processing and return or just secondary use or whatever it may be, and really think about once it's gone, and you have as much of a responsibility of controlling that user's flow as you did collecting from them in the first place, and that has to be integrated in your policy and also the way that you connect APIs. The rights associated with those APIs and all those different things at the technology level, they need to be built in to protect that data because you are the owner of it. And Tim, I forgot your comment you mentioned before about the stewardship of the data is a really good way to think about it. But the data is, you have a privilege to have that data, and that means how you collected it, how you store it, and how you share it downstream.
Yeah, so I kind of want to follow up on that last point that Kevin's making in terms of sharing user data with third parties. What are some things that app developers should be thinking? What are some issues that they should be thinking through before they even collect the data? Because nowadays it's very difficult to run an app service where you're not sharing some data with third parties. Tim, I have a feeling you have some thoughts on this.
Well, so there's a couple of things. So there's a big tendency these days to use a lot of analytic services. To do a lot of kind of interaction tracking, behavioral tracking, all of this kind of stuff. Everybody wants to have metrics. Everybody wants to build these data sets so they can look at how people are behaving. And you really have to take a critical look at what the information is that you're sending, because it's easy to get carried away with just the idea, these are our users, this is about them interacting with our app, and so it's okay for us to fire everything up. But you're probably not operating that service. You're putting a lot of that data in the hands of a third party. Sure, it's your account. But they may not be thinking about some of the issues that you are being concerned about, privacy, being concerned about application security, and you may inadvertently compromise that stuff. The other thing that I would encourage people to be very aware of is that a lot of times there are places where you are kind of creating foreign keys, unintentional foreign keys in other people's data sets into your user base. The fact that you are for instance there are services out there that given an email address will feed you all sorts of demographic stuff about people, and yeah, that may be your user. You may have the right to that data. This may be publicly information that you're getting back, but the fact that you're interacting with this service and you're the one feeding this identity out starts to kind of add to that data set, because now you've added the fact that they're a customer of yours. And there's a certain amount of disclosure associated with that I think can be easy to overlook.
So on the first point, is there a technique that you can use other than reading a third party's privacy policy? So in terms of vetting the third parties that you do share data, is that kind of the best practice, do you think?
Well, it's nice sometimes if the code, and this is the case for some analytic services, happens to be open source, because then you can go audit it yourself. And that's been great for us in some cases, because we've kind of helped other people better secure their services. And made sure that we're not disclosing things for our users. The second part is make sure that you know who to contact that you know that there's an accountable party, that you know that you have open channels in the event that issues do come out, so that you know you can try to help get them addressed quickly.
That's awesome. I'm going to open it up to other panelists. Any other thoughts on sharing user information with third parties?
Yeah, I guess one other point would be is you should really look at the flow of that data to third parties on your own also, kind of provide some monitoring around it, for whether it be a mobile app or a website, and really see what are the bits and bytes that are flowing out, and just keep track of especially with SDKs and things that are a little more black box, and just making sure that the behavior is as you expected and what you agreed to contractually. One other point that would be relevant for ad-supported apps or websites is really an advertising policy, which is really a little different than a privacy policy, but what are the rules of engagement of data collection and advertising within your app or site? And that sort of sets the rules of engagement around this downstream activity, and I think it works in addition to the privacy policy and things you should look at, whether it be an advertising company or a cloud service provider or whatever that doesn't do advertising. Having some form of partner vendor policy that goes just beyond your privacy policy and looks at all the different elements of security which a privacy policy might not cover directly.
And as a lawyer, look, a couple things. I realize that a lot of times you don't have the power to negotiate any terms with third-party vendors, especially I used to represent a lot of startups, and I totally get the situation that a lot of people are in, but you can still ask the questions. So just probe a little bit and try and get out of the business development guy's face and kind of into maybe the product guy's face or an engineer's face, and just say, hey, what do you guys reuse this data for? Because I guarantee you everybody reuses data for something. And look for, this is like the one tip that I've started learning over the years, just look for the contractual term that says, you give us a license to reuse data for our products and services. Just look for that, because that's a sign of a fact that you might want to ask a couple more questions, especially about secondary uses. So,
no, again, to me, it again comes back to where's your focus, because you're the one in the relationship with that customer. You're the one that's trying to provide them with something which delights them, which they're thrilled with. And being in that relationship, you also have the opportunity to really clearly state, how is this data being used? And so by taking these steps, looking at the different vendors you may be using, different parties you may be using, and being able to convey that and make your choices about the types of companies that you want to work with, I think is very important.
Great. So we are going to open the floor up for questions, and if there aren't any, I'm going to plug in my machine. Hopefully it'll work well, and we have kind of a real specific scenario that we'll run through with you all. This has been a little bit abstract maybe, but we want to kind of try to make it realer. So we have a actual hypothetic. So the lawyers, this will bring you back to law school, and we can spot some issues and talk through a scenario. Okay, so let me paraphrase the question. You want to get your app to market as fast as you can, and you also want to do the right thing by your users by signifying the privacy practices. The users don't have a lot of tolerance. What are some techniques? Is that about right? Okay. I'm going to plug in my computer. Does anybody, Tim, you kind of addressed this in your intro a little bit.
Make it cultural. It was a little bit easy for me to say, because like I said, this is what we do, and this is what I do. But it's something that's been there. There has been a core privacy conscience to look out embedded in the development team from day one and every day since then. And I would encourage everybody to find that and integrate that into your team.
I think that's absolutely right. I think for Microsoft, you go back to 2006, we released an external version of the Microsoft privacy standards for developers. It's still out there. We've updated our internal standards since then. But in that, we provide different scenarios which are really intended to help guide folks who are trying to build something and understand the privacy implications of that. So I completely agree. It's all about, it's got to start with the culture.
And so that's part of the reason why we have the Hypo, is so you could see that just like you two were talking about culture, different companies are going to be different. Different UXs are different. That's why privacy is actually, frankly, so interesting, is because the manifestation of what that notice looks like for your app, say you're like uploading someone's photo before they hit the upload button, there are different ways to reflect that in your UX, which would make sense for your UX, that wouldn't make sense for someone else's UX. So it's engaging in these dialogues that will get you to the answer of what makes sense for your app. And having the privacy thought, as one of the things you think about as you're designing. So it's a design constraint or a design, or it helps you to design your app. You can think of it any which way you want. Will help you get to the right answer better. Plus, you have the ability to rev, right? So V2 of the app could be better than V1. So.
Yeah, I think this is a real tough answer, and something I've worked on my 4 years at Trustee. We worked at how to communicate privacy better, because I don't like privacy policies personally. There's ways to make it graphical. There's ways to layer it. There's ways to use different icons, whatever, that allow you to insert at the point of data collection, or that point of where you think the user might be most concerned, and at least allow them something that they can then drill down into and read more. Most people aren't going to go and read a long policy, but if you can put bits along the way at the point where you think it's most sensitive, I think that's the best way to do it. And it's not a prescriptive approach. But the other thing I would say is, this is an area where you got to take a risk and try to make it light, try to be very friendly to the consumer, try some things that might not work. I think back to the experiment we tried to do where you had to explain behavioral targeting and what an opt-out means in a blurb, and we started off with text, which no one read, video that no one clicked on, and we came to a very simple kind of back and forth arrow that showed some trade-off of data for something, right? And we just kept experimenting and trying to get people to give us views on what they understood this to be. Read this and tell us what it meant. And again, we're highly focused on that. It's not the kind of, I don't think everyone would do that same discipline, but I would just say just try. I mean, your consumers will be, end users will be happy that you're trying, even if it's not perfect in execution, and you'll build a warm and fuzzy that you can build up on and refine it to be more effective second.
Are there any more questions now, or should we move on to this hypothetical and walk through it together? Okay, cool. There might be some time for questions at the end. Okay, Jishnu, do you feel like comfortable walking people through this?
I'm sorry, I'm reading it now, and it sounds a little caveman, so I might have to have a caveman accent when I read it. But anyway, okay. So a photo sharing app is designed to send small emoticons using your face, a picture of your face, to your friends. So the app uploads photos automatically as soon as they're taken, so the app seems faster, as opposed to waiting for the user to enter a flow. The developer wants to use location-based advertising that uses the location of the photos, so not through the geolocation API, but actually in the photos, the metadata of the photos themselves, to kind of determine the location of the user. The app allows you to log in with Facebook. It stores emoticons with short messages as a part of a Facebook wall update that every single photo you take will automatically do. So that's the Hypo, and I know that a lot of that may or may not make sense. From an actual app perspective, we thought we could kind of tear it apart. So now that I read it, I'm going to look at everyone else and they can start.
Cool. Any issues that you spot right away?
I can lob a few out. I guess, first and foremost would be the question about the actual users of this app. So there's a couple things that come to mind about, do you have kids, and are they under 13, and are they going to be absolutely firing out these pictures, some they don't even care about, maybe their parents or whatever it may be.
Yeah, so I'm going to stop you there because I think that particular issue maybe deserves a red flag on it. So Coppa, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, is something that all app developers at this point need to be aware of, should be aware of. It has certain. I'm not the expert on this for sure in this room, especially because I know there's a lot of people in here who follow this stuff very closely. But generally speaking, if you are a child under 13 years of age, or if you are dealing with children under 13 years of age, there's lots of rules about information that you can collect from them and ways that you can interact with them. Anybody on the panel want to talk a little bit more specifically about Coppa and things to be aware of?
I can add a comment or two just from a solution perspective. So I think you guys are the lawyers, you can discuss the law better. But I think the point is that this is another type of consent requirement, where, as we all know, that kids have parents and parents need to give permission. And so it's more about how do you incorporate that permission process in the flow of some sort of app like this. And that's sort of the big challenge right now with the Coppa 2.0 law, is how do you do that in a way that's not massively disruptive to the user experience of the flow. And there's some good things that are being developed to address this.
All right, before anyone says another word, I want to say, disclaimer, nothing up here is considered legal advice. Does that make you guys relax at all? No? All right, basically read Coppa, maybe talk to Laura Berger. No. Okay, so moving on from there, any other issues that you're spotting in this?
So am I going to be surprised that the app is sending my pictures automatically? Am I going to be pleased about that? Am I going to feel like I have an easy way to control that, because maybe that's not all right with me?
Yep. Yeah. I think a lot of it, to me, has to do with what is your reasonable expectation. I mean, is it reasonable to expect that users, their location data is going to be tracked based on their uploading of a photo? Issues like that. Jishnu, do you have thoughts on ways to deal with that? Is that a reasonable expectation for an app developer?
I think so. With privacy, this is how I've seen it play out. So with privacy, it's not necessarily about what you do, although there are certain things you shouldn't be doing. It's much more about how you do it. And so, couple thoughts, right? I mean, so right now you're semi-circumventing, at least if you're on iOS. I don't even know if you can do this on iOS without a permission popping up. But you could be circumventing the platform's ability to prompt the user for geolocation, right? And so knowing that, you should design that into the flow of your upload process. The other thing is the photos going up right away, so maybe there's a way to reflect that, right, with a loading bar or something like that, that shows in you, and these are just horrible ideas that I came up with just now, but you get the idea. You kind of engage in this back and forth of how can I show the user. So the first thing we do is identify those things are surprising, right, which is important to our user base. So how can I show the user the feature in a way that it wouldn't be surprising? And there's a lot of ways to do that. It's not just one way. It's not like, boom, cookie notice that tells you that there's a cookie on the website, right? That's not a...
Make it an option and be friendly about it, The dialogue might, for instance, say something like, hey, look, if you allow us to upload all of your photos immediately when you take them, we can provide a better, faster, snappier user experience with you. Would you like to engage this now? And make sure that there's a fallback option that degrades graceful if they choose not to.
Yep. And also, I mean, one business model that's interesting and is evolving, a lot of companies are doing this, is we will give you this service for free, but we are going to target you with ads. And if you want to pay a couple dollars, you can have it without any ads and without any tracking, or any, I mean, they're going to track you in certain ways, but they're not going to share the information with the advertiser. So, these are all things that I think app developers should probably be thinking through.
One other thing I thought was interesting in this one is that I would consider this a pretty high-risk app from a privacy perspective. And what you've been seeing a lot about apps, when you download it for the first time, they have sort of a little tutorial one page with the kind of the handwriting saying this is the kind of key features and things. That would probably be a good thing to do in something that's this potentially sensitive to some users, because once that photo goes up and it's too late, you might even want to have a confirm once it's up there, or of course a withdrawal. But having that expectation really clearly up front in terms of something UX-wise would be probably a very safe bet in terms of making sure there's no surprises downstream.
What about particularly the Facebook login? I mean, I know a lot of, obviously a lot of app developers love this. Does anybody on the panel have experience with that particular issue? Any thoughts on that? Or anybody in the audience for that matter? No, that's okay. Go for it. Thanks.
So I'm Deborah Farber. I'm a privacy data professional product strategies. In my experience in advising on those apps, you don't want to just hook in to the Facebook platform just for the sake of, oh, it's there, I'm going to leverage it. You really want to understand that flow. Is it useful to the user? Because otherwise, in addition to some other features like the passive no, well, so when you're doing like the Spotify or something where everything's being shared,
Right.
that passive sharing
Yep.
option that they have, and there are some apps you don't necessarily want to have everything shared. So to make that by default or to just to hook into every single thing that Facebook has,
Yep.
it could be great for your flow, but you really want to think about what value is adding to the user and then determine whether or not that should be by default
Yeah.
share or by default don't share. So
Yeah, I think that's great that you brought up the default issue, because I know for a lot of app developers, there's huge amounts of research that says, the default is basically what is going to be the reality of the situation for the vast majority of users. Mozilla makes its living off the default with Google, and a lot of people do, And so, I mean, do people have experience with the default and going kind of against the grain, or not?
So as a user, I hope you choose to provide multiple options.
Yeah.
Because if the only option that you provide me is logging with Facebook, there's a pretty good chance that I will choose not to participate. It's okay to be there as an option, but I think you should have a plan B.
Yeah.
I would say down here, like on 3 here. We are seeing pretty good signs that just-in-time notification is resulting in different behaviors than what they expected. I know that some of the researchers at Berkeley and others have been looking at some of these questions, and I've looked at screenshots of people's settings on location, and been surprised. Cynicism has been pushed back, and people are, in fact, in some cases on location, particularly, sliding that slider to off. So as you look at this is that first notification. The problem you face sometimes is that nobody remembers what they agreed to.
Yep.
Six weeks later, or 2 weeks later, or 24 hours later, or
Yep.
maybe an hour later.
Yep.
So the problem is that just-in-time notification is producing the multi-option, as you said, degrades gracefully, provides a null set when necessary. The only other thing that I saw here is, only other thing that we run into on this is that you say developer wants to use location-based advertising to use location for photos. What it doesn't deal with at all is there any persistence of the information that's collected by the third-party advertising network. And that's something that I believe that regulators, sitting next to Laura, don't hit me. I think that's something that regulators in particular are watching for. Everything in there is really clear to the user. You've all seen the stuff we're doing on this UI stuff. But did the user understand from this that the location-based advertising that was used in order to provide this data never got rid of that data and is aggregating with other data they didn't contain?
Yeah.
So I don't have an answer, but I would say as somebody who works on this is a problem that folks like Laura have been asking us about.
Sure. I mean, you bring up a bunch of great points, but one of them is the fact that you can give somebody notice once at the time when in the initial user flow. The person has the app installed for 2 years. Maybe you're sharing the device with your wife. Maybe my wife doesn't feel comfortable sharing the types of information that I share. Any strategies along those lines? Persistent notification.
I think there's a couple of different approaches in terms of what's been talked about earlier, which is as you go through this, you very quickly begin to identify what data is being collected, who it's being shared with, and you should then also be able to identify how long it's being stored and how it's being used, which then feeds into the notice that you want to provide to your user, and there's multiple ways to provide that notice to the user. But then coming back to the month later or 2 months later, understanding for some of these key issues, having the controls, I think as Tim was mentioning earlier, having those controls available for the user to make choices how they want to leverage that app later on, and then also having that clear privacy notice so that if they do have questions, they can obviously then have a very clear, succinct understanding of what data is being collected, and then they can use the controls if they're not comfortable with it.
Yep. I think another technique, which again it may sound extreme, but is to give the users a notification every single time they're sharing this sensitive data like location, but then give them the option to turn it off for good, right? So, I mean, I guess in my head, I feel like there are apps that are doing more persistent notification, but then you can opt out of it and say, don't ever show me this message again.
Yeah, and you can train, so there's all these great techniques, right? You can train your users, which sounds horrible, but you can train them to kind of see a persistent icon. So the notification doesn't have to be persistent. You've got this icon that shows up, which is what iOS does, right, with location information that shows up during the sharing and then goes away when the sharing's gone, supposedly. So what I think is really interesting about the Facebook example actually is I guess the privacy threat modeling aspect of it is that when you're thinking about privacy, and if you go back to the whole idea of like user sovereignty and trying to enable the user to have control over their data, then really when you think about it, it's not just you're worried about, it's also other people. So we've talked about third parties we have contracts with, but like that default wall sharing, say you send a nice emoticon to your spouse and it automatically gets posted on the wall and it's not something you wanted everybody in the world to see. That's just something to kind of, you're modeling like your user, what is their flow? Like what are they going to be using this for and what do they expect once they finish uploading? And so maybe that's something that's a feature someone can turn on and is default off. Like that's where you can set your defaults intelligently to make the app kind of, as Tim was saying earlier, delight your users. You want to make sure everything you do delights your users. And I think it was said earlier that nobody really cares about privacy. I think nobody cares about privacy until they do. That's the rule. So try not to make them care, right? Try to make your app beautiful and like people don't have to worry about their privacy.
It generally only takes one person waking up one morning and deciding they do care about privacy to make you a headline. So it's wise to just go ahead and think about it in advance and just assume that everything that you did becomes a headline. Will that make people excited and flock to your product, or will that make them scared and run away from your product?
Act as though everything you do is public.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Because privacy's dead.
Yeah, it's a great point that it is, there are consequences to sharing information now that might not show up for a couple years down the road, right? So, yeah, okay. I think that we're getting ready to wrap up, but I'd like to hear any final thoughts on privacy is dead, the direction of privacy, any final advice for app developers who might be starting out thinking about these types of issues.
Can I just say one thing? You know how you mentioned that Mozilla makes its money on default? What's really interesting is we make our money on default, but the reason people use us is actually to get off the default. And that's actually, and I hate to pick on Microsoft, especially since I got to say, I like Internet Explorer now, but I used to not. And that's when I started using Firefox, long before I ever worked at Mozilla. And people will leave your product, right? If it doesn't do what they want it to do, they will leave your product. And if this is something they really care about, and it becomes a big issue for them, the market will help correct your error. So that's something to think about.
So I'm glad you like IE now. I think just wanted to play off the kind of the consequences discussion. I think one thing that was mentioned earlier, and I think that we talked about it up here as well, is that, yeah, absolutely, everyone is concerned about the consequences and should be mindful of that. But I really want to emphasize something that I think everybody's up here has said, which is it's really about there is an opportunity to work with customers who really are asking for privacy protections and respect for their privacy. And there's that huge opportunity to deliver your customers something really, really great. And having that commitment for your company is so, so important and very helpful in getting you there with your customers.
I think you can look at it as privacy as dead, or you can look at it as privacy as a very active conversation, in my opinion. And I think there's an opportunity to make this part of your brand, make this part of your pitch, make this part of the trust that you're building with your user base. And again, at the end of the day, focus on delighting your users, and remember that this can be a part of that process.
Yeah, I think my comments this would be consumers want convenience, they want social, and they want relevance. And I think what's happening now among developers are really pushing the frontier of what it takes to deliver that, which involves data and users interaction. And I think that's why privacy is hot right now, is that we're going to make a few mistakes as an industry and we're going to get slapped back, or hopefully not by a regulator, but by users, moving to another system or whatever it may be, or some combination. Yep. But I think we're exploring a little bit, and I think there, again, comes this point where you kind of feel where you're getting something. I mean, the comment back there was, it's not like developers are robots, they're people too. They kind of know what they're doing, even though the consequences are downstream. And I think you feel that as you're going through this. You've got to take some risks as a business, right? But you kind of know when you're hitting that point, and probably should, if you're going to take the risk, layer on a little heavier disclosure, or take a little bit of extra time to minimize what could potentially go wrong. And I think that's just a calculation we need to learn as product development people and businesses that are delivering these three benefits to consumers.
Yeah, I was totally being sarcastic about the privacy thing, just in case that wasn't clear.
I know. Nice. Okay, yeah, my closing thought is that not every app developer needs to be like a total privacy nut, geek, wonk, zealot, but they have to take care of it, because that's just the world that we're living in now, is that, it is similar to having to do your taxes at the end of the year. And try to make the best of it and try to think about it from the start, because if you think about it from the start, you could avoid some serious pitfalls down the road. So thanks all to the panelists, and thanks for having us here. Thank you.